Hi there. So we are doing notes for lesson 14A, and this is solving equations with variables on both sides of the equation. So the first thing that you're going to do is you are going to write the equation down. So the first equation is y minus 4 equals negative 3y minus 8. Okay, now, I want you to notice that we have a y over here, and there's no number by it. Well, when there's no number by it, remember that's an invisible 1, because 1 times y is y. So 1y minus 4 equals negative 3y minus 8. Okay, now we've got a problem, because we need our variable to be all on one side. And if you look, you can see that we have variables on both sides. So what we want to do, we have a 1y on the left and we have a negative 3y on the right. And what we want to do is we want to move the variable on the right over to the left side. We always want the variable to be on the left. So that variable is negative 3y, and another way that we can say it is minus 3y. So what is the inverse of minus? Plus. So we are going to add 3y to both sides, plus 3y. Okay, on the left side, 1y plus 3y is 4y minus 4 equals negative 3y plus 3y is 0, so we cross it out, negative 8. Okay, now if you look at our equation, it looks exactly like the ones we've been solving for weeks and weeks now. So we find our variable, now we only have one variable, and then we want to undo the addition or subtraction. So notice that we have a minus 4. So the inverse of subtraction is addition. So we are going to plus 4 on both sides. So now we get 4y. Negative 4 plus 4 is 0, so we cross that out, equals negative 8 plus 4. We have 8 negatives and 4 positives. If you have both negatives and positives, you subtract. 8 minus 4 is 4. Now, you look at the one that's bigger. So notice we had 8 negatives and only 4 positives. So if we combine them, we end up with matching ones with 4 negatives left over because our negatives were bigger. So now we have 4y equals negative 4. Our last step is to undo the multiplication. So we find our variable again, and we find the number that's right next to the variable, and that's 4. Remember that 4y means 4 times y. So the inverse of times is divide. So we divide by 4, divide by 4. 4 divided by 4 is 1y. And then negative 4 divided by 4. A negative divided by a positive is negative. And 4 divided by 4 is 1. So our answer is y equals negative 1. Okay, now we want to check our work. So when we go back to check our work, we go back to the original problem and we rewrite it. So I'm going to write 1y, but instead of y, I'm going to put parentheses. Minus 4 equals negative 3, but instead of the y, parentheses, minus 8. So notice I did 1y, but instead of y, I put parentheses. Minus 4 equals negative 3, parenthesis, instead of y, minus 8. Okay, now I need to put a number in that parenthesis. So I go back and I look and I see that we got y equals negative 1. So I'm going to put negative 1 into both of those parentheses. Now I'm just going to simplify. 1 times negative 1 is negative 1 minus 4. Negative 3 times negative 1 is 3 minus 8. Now remember, whenever you do minus, you always change it to plus the opposite. So plus negative plus negative. Okay, now on the left, I have negative 1 plus negative 4. So I have 1 negative and then another 4 negatives. If they're all negative, you add them. So 1 plus 4 is 5, but it's 5 negatives, equals 3 plus negative 8. Okay, I have 3 positives and 8 negatives. If you have negatives and positives, you subtract. 8 minus 3 is 5. Now we look and we had more negatives. We had 8 negatives and only 3 positives. So that's negative 5 because those are the leftovers. And it checks. Now, Before you move on to number 2, make sure you have all of the work and the check done in your My Open Math. Then type -1 into the answer and submit and go on to number 2. So we go to number 2, and again, the first thing that we do is write it down. So number 2 is -3x minus 2, -3x minus 2 equals -x minus 8. Now, again, do you notice we have a -x right there with no number? Remember, that's an invisible 1. So we have -3x on the left and we have -1x on the right. Remember that you always want to take the one on the right and you want to move it over to the left. So we have to do the inverse of -1x, and the inverse of minus is plus. So we're going to plus 1x and plus 1x. On the left, we have -3x plus 1x. So we have 3 negatives and 1 positive. If we have both positives and negatives, we subtract. 3 minus 1 is 2. And we had 3 negatives and only 1 positive. So we had more negatives, so it's -2. -2x minus 2 equals -1x plus 1x is 0, so we cross it out, -8. Okay, now again, our problem is now just like we've been solving for weeks now. So we find our variable, now we only have one variable, and we find the plus or the minus. And notice we have a -2. The inverse of minus is plus, so we are going to add 2 on both sides. So we get -2x, -2 plus 2 is 0, so that crosses out, equals -8 plus 2. Okay, we have 8 negatives and 2 positives. If we have both positive and negative, we subtract. 8 minus 2 is 6. And then we look, we had 8 negatives and only 2 positives, so it's -6. The last step is to undo the multiplication. So we find our x, and the number by the x is -2. So we divide by -2, divide by -2. -2 divided by -2 is 1x. A negative divided by a negative is positive. -6 divided by -2 is +3. So we have our answer. Okay, now we need to go do our check. So we rewrite the original equation. Remember, we always start by rewriting the original. So we have -3, but instead of x, we put parentheses, -2 equals -1 parentheses -8. Now, what number do we put in those parentheses? Well, we go over here and we see that x equals -3. No, x equals +3. And so that's the number that we put in the parentheses. Now we just simplify. -3 times +3 is -9 minus 2 equals -1 times 3 is -3 minus 8. Now, whenever we have minus, remember we change it to plus the opposite. So plus negative plus negative. So on the left, we have -9 plus -2. So we have 9 negatives and then 2 more negatives. If they're all negative, we add them, so we have -11. And on the other side, we have -3 plus -8. Again, all negatives, so we add them, we have -11, and check, it worked. Okay, now again, remember that you got to make sure you have all the work and the check, and then put 3 into your answer and submit and go on to number 3. So we go to number 3. The first thing that we do is we write down the equation. So the equation is 5 parentheses x minus 4 equals -6 parentheses 2x plus 1. Okay, now when we get to number 3, you're going to notice this one's different than number 1 and number 2. So if you look at it, do you notice they've got parentheses? When there's parentheses, we have to distribute. Remember that when you have 5 and then a parenthesis, it means 5 times everything in the parenthesis. So when you distribute, you're multiplying. So we have to do 5 times x, and we get 5x, and then 5 times -4, and we get -20, equals -6 times 2x, which is -12x, -6 times 1, which is negative 6. So the first thing you have to do if there's parentheses is distribute. Now, do you notice now the problem looks exactly like number 1 and number 2? So if you look, notice we have 5x's on the left and we have negative 12x's on the right. We always want to take the one on the right and move it over. So that's minus 12x. The inverse of minus is plus, so we're going to plus 12x plus 12x. 5x plus 12x is 17x minus 20 equals negative 12x plus 12x is 0, so we cross it out, negative 6. Okay, now we've gotten this problem down to the way that problems have looked for weeks now. So now we only have one variable, so we find our x, and then remember we have to find the plus or minus, so we find a minus 20. So to undo minus, we have to add, so we have to add 20 to both sides. So we have 17x, negative 20 plus 20 is 0, equals negative 6 plus 20. So we have 6 negatives and 20 positives. If we have both positives and negatives, we subtract. 20 minus 6 is 14. Now we look and we had 6 negatives and 20 positives. We had more positives, therefore the 14 is the leftover positives, so it's positive. Our last step is to undo the multiplication. We find our x and we notice that 17 is right next to the x. So remember that means 17 times x. The inverse of multiply is divide. So we divide by 17, divide by 17. 17 divided by 17 is 1x, and then 14 over 17 is our answer. Now, at this point, we're ready to do our check, but instead of doing the check on our board, on our work area, we're actually going to do the check in the calculator. I want you to do the check on your paper, on your MyOpenMath, if the number comes out not a fraction. But if the answer comes out a fraction, then I want you to use the calculator to do the check. Okay? So we go up to our calculator and we click it, and we are going to type in this side. So we type in 5, open parenthesis, and then notice we want x. Well, the x was 14 over 17. And then if you go back and look, it says minus 4. So minus 4. Now, if you look at our answer, it comes out negative 15.882. Okay? So now we're going to check this side. So I have a little piece of paper and I wrote down negative 15.882. Now I'm going to backspace over that side. And our next side is negative 6. So negative 6, open parenthesis, 2 times. And then if you look, that's our x. So that's our 14 over 17. And then after the 14 over 17 is plus 1. So plus 1, and look, negative 15.882, so it checks. It works. So now we type our answer in here, 14 over 17, and we submit and go on to number 4. Okay, the first thing that we do when we get to a new problem is we write it down. So negative 3 parentheses c plus 2 equals 3 parentheses 4c minus 1. Okay, remember, again, we have parentheses. Anytime you have parentheses, your first step is to distribute. So we're going to distribute. So we take negative 3 times c, and we get negative 3c. Then negative 3 times 2, negative 6, equals 3 times 4c, 12c, 3 times negative 1, negative 3. So always distribute if you see parentheses. Okay, now we have to get the c's that are on the right side, we have to move them over to the left. Notice that we have 12c and it's positive 12. So remember, that's like plus 12. So the inverse of plus is minus. So we're going to minus 12c minus 12c. So on the left, we have negative 3c plus negative 12c. So we have all negatives. So we combine them together. We have a total of 15 negatives. So negative 15c minus 6 equals 12c minus 12c is 0, negative 3. Okay, now this looks exactly like all of the equations we've been solving for weeks now. So we find our variable, and then we have to find the plus or the minus. Now, I need to tell you that that's what we're looking for, the minus 6. But you might look at that and go, wait a minute, there's a negative on the 15. So here's the problem. The negative 15 is attached to the c. So we don't want to deal with that right now. We want to deal with the number that is either added or subtracted to the c. So that's the minus 6. The inverse of minus is plus, so we're going to plus 6 on both sides. So plus 6 plus 6. So now we get negative 15c, negative 6 plus 6 is 0, equals negative 3 plus 6. We have 3 negatives and 6 positives. We have both, so we have to subtract. 6 minus 3 is 3. Now, we had 3 negatives and 6 positives, so our leftovers are positive, so it's positive 3. And our final step is to undo the multiplication. So I find my variable, and the number next to it is negative 15. So I divide by negative 15, divide by negative 15. Negative 15 divided by negative 15 is 1c, and then we have negative 3 over 15. Remember, we have a fraction. Now, notice that the negative, I moved it to the top of the fraction. The negative can be anywhere, it doesn't matter. But this is not reduced, so I need to reduce it. So these will both divide by 3. So negative 3 divided by 3 is negative 1. 15 divided by 3 is 5. So my answer is negative 1/5. Okay, now because my answer came out a fraction, I'm going to do the check in the calculator. Again, make sure you have all the work written down in My Open Math before you move on. Okay, now I'm going to go up to the calculator and click on it. So remember that we start by typing in the left side. So we type negative 3, parenthesis, and then if you look, we need our c, which was negative 1/5. So negative 1 over 5, and then it says plus 2. So plus 2. And we get negative 5.4. So now I have a piece of paper and I wrote down negative 5.4. Now I backspace and I type the second side. So 3 parenthesis 4 times. Now remember that for c I got negative 1/5. So negative 1 over 5. And then it says minus 1. Minus 1. And look, negative 5.4. So again, it checks. So I type in negative 1 over 5 and I submit. And I go on to number 5. Okay, and this is the last one. And the first thing we always do is write down the problem. So the problem is negative 3 parenthesis 3x plus 1 equals negative 4 parenthesis negative 5x minus 2 close parenthesis minus 40. Okay, first step, you always have to distribute if you've got parentheses. Negative 3 times 3x is negative 9x. Negative 3 times 1 is negative 3 equals negative 4 times negative 5x is 20x. Negative 4 times negative 2 is plus 8 minus 40. Okay, now, again, remember we have an x on this side, we have an x on this side. We want to move the x on the right over to the left. So on the right, we have plus 20x. Notice it's a positive. So what's the opposite of plus? Minus. So we're going to minus 20x minus 20x. Negative 9x plus negative 20x. So they're both negative. If they're both negative, then we combine them together and add them, and we have negative 29x minus 3 equals 20x minus 20x is 0. Okay, now we have 8 minus 40. Do you see that right there? So I'm going to make the minus plus the opposite. So I have 8 positives plus 40 negatives. If you have both positives and negatives, you subtract. 40 minus 8 is 32. I had 8 positives and 40 negatives, so my leftovers are all negative. And so now I have negative 29x minus 3 equals negative 32. I find my x, because now I only have one of them, and I find either what's added or subtracted. And notice we have the minus 3. So the opposite of minus is plus, so we're going to plus 3 plus 3. So we have negative 29x, negative 3 plus 3 is 0, so we cross that out, equals negative 32 plus 3. So we have 32 negatives and 3 positives. If we have both positive and negative, we subtract. 32 minus 3 is 29. We had 32 negatives and only 3 positives, so the leftovers are negative. And finally, we have to divide. So we find our x, and the number next to the x is negative 29. So we divide by negative 29, divide by negative 29. Negative 29 divided by negative 29 is 1x. And then on the other side, we have negative 29 divided by negative 29, which is 1. So our answer is x equals 1. Okay, now we need to do our check. So when we do our check, we rewrite the original equation. But when we get to the x, we put parentheses. So we have negative 3, open parenthesis, 3, parenthesis, parenthesis, plus 1 equals negative 4, open parenthesis, negative 5, parenthesis, parenthesis, minus 2, close parenthesis, minus 40. Now, what number do I put in that parenthesis? Well, if I look back, didn't I get 1 for my answer? So I put 1 there and I put 1 there. Now I simplify. Now remember when you're simplifying that you'll always have to do the parentheses first. So I have my negative 3 sitting out here, and then in my parenthesis I have 3 times 1, which is 3, plus 1. And then over on the other side I have negative 4, parenthesis, negative 5 times 1, which is negative 5, minus 2, close your parenthesis, minus the 40. Okay, now we have negative 3 times 3 plus 1 is 4 equals negative 4 times, okay, I'm going to change this to plus negative. So I have 5 negatives plus 2 negatives. If they're all negative, I add, so negative 7 minus 40. Negative 3 times 4 is negative 12. Negative 4 times negative 7 is positive 28 minus 40. Change that to plus the opposite. So now I have negative 12 equals, okay, I have 28 plus negative 40. So I have 28 positives and 40 negatives. If I have both positives and negatives, I have to subtract. 40 minus 28 is 12. I had 28 positives and 40 negatives. So I had more negatives, so the 12 is negative, and it checks, and it works. Make sure you have all of the work and all of the check in your notes on your screen. Then type 1 into the answer and submit, and have an awesome day.